Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Matthew Sanabria, and in this video we're going to talk about making high quality contributions to open source software, your own software, software at your job, whatever projects you may be working on, how to make high quality contributions to those projects. Now, a week ago or a couple weeks ago, wherever this was, I submitted a tweet and I said, hey, I spoke to a few open source maintainers and they all mentioned how low quality contributions led to burnout. And a few of them even stopped accepting contributions for a while so that they can recover from that burnout. And I was going to make a video on it, and here's the video. So talking about open source contributions, or just contributions in general, they generally, or I at least like to bucket them into two different buckets or two different categories. One is reporting things, right? You're reporting things to work on. You're not actually fixing anything or whatever. You're just reporting things, reporting issues, reporting typos, reporting inconsistencies. You're just reporting things. The second bucket is actually making those changes, right? Proposing new changes, changing content, right? So you have the reporting side and like the proposal side, right? Like actually making changes. So those are the two buckets that I'll talk about. And the first one I'll talk about is the proposing changes, right? Submitting issues, submitting like questions, submitting like documentation issues, whatever it may be. And generally, when you're proposing things to change, you want to keep in mind these three things. One, most important, is context. Context is hugely important when you're reporting issues. Why is it important? Well, you need to list out the version of the software you're running. You need to list out the problem that you're having, like what actually happened. You need to list out the environment. Why are you seeing this, right? Like you need to give context to the maintainer so they know what's going on, right? You'll be surprised how many contributions I've seen that don't do this. They don't define the problem. They don't define the version that they're using. They don't define any of that stuff. So the maintainer is just left in the dark wondering what's going on here. What's the real issue here? After context, you really want to, if you can, now this one's more of like an optional if you can, but you really want to make sure that you propose some sort of solution, right? If you say that there's a bug with the software, and if you know kind of the solution that you would want to see, propose it. Just say, hey, I saw that this code had a bug here, and I think the solution here is to really update this variable because I think you're off by one index here, blah, blah, blah. If you know a solution or have an idea of a solution, propose it there. Say, hey, I don't know how to fix this, but I think the idea is this. That goes a long way to maintainers because it helps them frame their mind against the problem. And now they can see like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. I didn't see that. That's a good thing to keep in mind while I work on this. Moving back to context for a little bit, one thing that I just came into my mind that I forgot to the list is when you're providing context for a reported issue or a reported contribution, you absolutely need to list out a minimal reproduction if possible. And I say minimal, right? If you report an issue with code, you can't just say, hey, I got it in, I mean, you can, but you can't, it's really not the best use of your time and the maintainer's time to say, hey, here's how I reproduce this in my highly specific, unique to me environment that you don't have access to. Right? The issue only happens on this version of the software running in my specific cloud account, data center, whatever, at 7 o'clock, on the dot. That doesn't really help the maintainer reproduce this issue and get them that fast feedback loop that they need to fix it. So really, really try to put an effort to make a minimal reproduction so that way anybody that reads the issue can reproduce it with very, very minimal steps, right? And not just the number of steps, but I might not need to have your data center access to reproduce it, right? You should try to reproduce it in a way where it's broadly reproducible, not just uniquely to your situation. If you can, right? Sometimes issues happen in weird little spaces and you just can't reproduce it anywhere else. That's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that don't put any effort in after they report an issue to really try to whittle it down. And then the third thing is, are you following the contribution guidelines for the project, right? Is your communication clear and kind? Do you have the title of the issue or whatever it is, formatted correctly? Are you using labels? Are you answering the questions? Like all of that stuff, are you adhering to the code of conduct? All of that matters. Maintainers see it and they will, try to, they'll triage your issue accordingly. So going back, I want to show a couple issues that I've submitted or that I've seen people submit it and just talk about what's good and what's bad about them. The first one up is this, issue that I reported on the Datadog Terraform provider. And you'll see, like, from a glance, it's pretty clean, right? I'm adhering to their title guidelines, right? Because they want the resource that's affected in the title and then a brief description of what's happening. Very short, very sweet, straight to the point. Anyone reading the title can have an idea of what's happening. And then in the description of this issue, I filled everything out. I gave them the version, I have the resource that's affected, a example configuration file that you can use to reproduce it. So I'm shipping that context, right? So that anyone that reads this can understand. I gave them the debug output at the time. This is no longer an active link because I deleted it, but I gave them the debug output at the time. And then I said, hey, here's how you can reproduce with a minimal reproduction, right? So you don't need any special access. I mean, the only access you need is the access to Datadog because that's what the issue is about, but you don't need any other special, weird, unique to me access. Here's how you reproduce it. Done. What was good about the issue is that the maintainer now, they didn't need to ask me any follow-up questions. They're like, hey, we fixed this. Like, here you go. Have fun. What did I report it? I reported on the 14th. They said, hey, we actually fixed this a day later, and we're going to ship it in the next release. So it had to be fixed upstream, and then it'll be included here. But the maintainer had no further questions because the issue is super clear to them and able to reproduce. Contrast that with this example. Now, again, before I start, this is not a dig on the contributor here or the user here. This is not like a dig against them, not at all. But you see this issue here. This is on some Ruby build package or a project out there where people were using it, and where they were running a security scanner against it, the security scanner was raising this as an error. So the user here says, like, in the file, this mirror.yaml, you expose your access key. Apart from the fact that this might be a security concern, this is causing problems on the user end when scanning with security scanners. It's reporting this error. It would be great if you can change this to a GitHub secret, just like AWS secret access key. Not a bad report, right? This is really not a bad report from this outside perspective, but you'll see why this is not that great in a second. And you can see the author or the maintainer's response to this issue. He says, like, thanks for raising this issue. I won't, however, move this to a secret just because vulnerability tools consider it a critical error. And then he gives some reasons, right? You can try configuring a scanner so it doesn't consider it an error. Now, I didn't know this issue existed, which is kind of a problem on my part. You should always do your due diligence when submitting things, and I failed to do that. But I submitted an issue on this same repo about 6 months to a year later. And I said, hey, there is a clear text AWS access key in this file. Normally, it's not a big deal, but when Ruby build is installed using this method, it receives that file which security scanners report as a vulnerability. Instead of placing the clear text directly in that file, you can use a variable. That way, the access key is clear text for the maintainers, but remains out of the code for security scanners. And I gave a proposed solution. Now, this got accepted and merged, and this was fixed. So what's the difference? Why did mine get fixed and this other user's kind of ignored? Well, look at the tone, right? This other user said, in the file, you expose your key. You do this. Kind of pointing fingers at the maintainer. And he's also like kind of using a tone here where, like, this might be a security concern and it'd be great if you can do this. It's a combative tone. And they got a combative response from the maintainer, right? So you're butting heads with the maintainer. Whereas I didn't say your code, right? I didn't say you're doing this. I said there exists this key. I said normally it's not a problem, but we're seeing it in this case. So here's the context of what's happening and how to reproduce it. And then I offered a solution. I said, hey, you can probably do this. That way it's good for you and it's good for us. So I offered a more amicable compromise solution, and my wording here was not combative, and the maintainer was able to accept this. So I just wanted to see, give you those examples so that when you're contributing, you can see that. So this is an example, these are examples of good, high quality contributions from that reporting bucket, right? Reporting issues. Last thing I want to say before we move on to the other side is, if you are contributing to a project or you want to contribute to a project, then there's a contributing file at the root of the repo or somewhere in the repo. But generally speaking, a public project usually has a contributing guide or some sort of guidelines where you can read that before you contribute. And now, don't make contributions unless you read the guide. Please don't just Oh, I don't need to read the guide. I'm good. Read the guide. You'll be surprised because they list out their code of conduct, what they expect, how to format code, blah 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 blah. Read it. It really helps you make high quality contributions that the maintainer can be like, "Oh, clearly this person put the time. They respect my time as a maintainer. Clearly they read the docs, they read the contribution stuff. Let me see what's happening." So that's it from the reporting side. Let's go see how things look from the other side when we're actually proposing changes, not just reporting them. So you see here, I have another, this is actually a pull request now. So I'm actually proposing changes here. And the code changes aren't super important in this case. You can look it up. I mean, the links are all here. You can look them up if you want. The code changes aren't super important, but I found an issue running like multiple Docker push post processors, right? So in this case, there was already an existing issue that I've seen, and I wanted to fix it. In this pull request, I give detail as to what is happening. So I defined the problem. I said there's a race condition where if you run 2 Docker pushes at the same time, you'll actually log out and the credentials will be removed. So the secondary push action will no longer be able to do the push, right? So I identified the problem. I didn't entirely give a minimal reproduction because I didn't have to, right? That's more for the reporting side. But then I explained my code. I said, hey, here's what's happening. Here's what I'm going to fix. We're clearly shelling out to the Docker commands, and that stores the credentials in like a default location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify that default location to a temporary location. That way both processes get their own credentials and they don't run over each other. So this is a good example of proposing changes. So what are the kind of 3 things that I kept in mind when I was doing this? One, and then probably the most important one in my opinion, is a well-typed, well-written title and description. There has been so many times that I've seen people contributing to any open source and they're submitting pull requests and they don't have a description populated at all. Nothing's in the description. It's literally empty. And I'm like, well, why are you proposing code changes with no description? It's kind of, honestly, it's kind of disrespectful in my opinion, right? Have the courtesy to write a description in there, not just for the maintainers, but also for your future self and other future readers, so that people can come to this pull request or this change and they say, oh, I understand the problem. I understand what the author did to solve it, and I have the context now, right? And in this description, you should really keep in mind 2 high-level things. You should define what the problem is, and you should define why you chose the solution or what the solution does, right? What's the problem, what's the solution, and why? So if you can keep those 2 things in mind with a contribution, you'll be good. Then the next thing is scope. Consider the scope of the changes that you're proposing, right? Are you proposing 99 files changed in one pull request? Or is there some logical boundary that you can break this up maybe into multiple pull requests so that it's easier for the maintainers to review? Also, is your diff clean, right? If I went to the files changed, is the diff relatively clean so that the author can understand, or so that the reviewer can understand like what specifically changed? Or did you like copy and paste things to a completely different file and now you have this large red diff with this large green diff and it's hard to tell what changed within, right? These are things you should keep in mind. And I've seen a lot of pull requests just get closed just because of exhaustion, right? It was hard to review it because it was so big, it wasn't broken up correctly, the diffs were unclean, and they're like, I can't review this, right? So think about that. And the last thing, just like I said with the other reporting side, contribution, right? Contribution guidelines. Make sure you're following the contribution guidelines for the project. In this case, I made sure that the code was formatted correctly. I made sure that, I use the same syntax and the same conventions that they want. Even though these changes were relatively straightforward, again, I saw that existing code used, like new lines to separate things. So I did that with my code. I separated it. I just adhered to the coding style and the coding guidelines so that this code will better integrate with the project. So this is an example of one of those. Let's look at another one. So if I look at this one, this is another contribution that I made. And mind you, I've had bad contributions too, like where I didn't always follow these guidelines. But that's why I'm making this video, so that we all can learn. This is another example of a contribution I made to the open source FluentBit project. And here I have ran into an issue where I had an application that was only exporting lowercase proxies, and Fluidbit was just ignoring them, and they only expected uppercase proxies. So instead of, I fixed it on my end by going to an uppercase proxy, but I said, hey, most software supports both lowercase and uppercase proxies. And I proposed this issue, and I said, hey, here's the problem. To my knowledge, there's no standard around proxy variables. Applications can choose to honor one or both or whatever. And I said, Fluentbit has only honored the uppercase, and this change is going to add support for the lowercase while maintaining the existing preference for the uppercase variable when both are defined. And then I gave all of the required questions that they asked. So I defined the problem, I described my solution, and here you go. The maintainers received it. They said, looks good to me. Oh my God, thanks, Here, can you also commit changes to the documentation in addition to this? And I said, okay, and here's the pull request. We had a very nice discussion. Everything got merged. Everyone was happy. So another good example of a good pull request. How about an example of a bad pull request? Well, there's one over here from Epic Games. Many of you might actually have known this when it became like a little viral thing on the internet for a day or two. But somebody submitted a pull request to Epic Games, their sign up repository, and they said, hey, perfect for gorgeous looks, can push ASAP. They mentioned the maintainer. They mentioned another group, right? They mentioned a couple different groups here. And then they said, hey, Epic team, a day later, they said, hey, verify the pull request and merge ASAP. Horrible example of a pull request, right? This is what not to do. And then someone here said, hey, I think you just notified about 400,000 members. Horrible example of a pull request, horrible example of contributions. This is a low quality contribution. What happened ends up getting closed. And we don't even have to look at the changes to understand why this is a bad pull request. The title's bad. It doesn't tell me anything about what's happening. The description's bad. No recount of what the problem is, no recount of what their solution is, nothing. And then, dare I say, harassing the maintainers here with, follow-up mentions. Not a good look for something that's called good looking, right? And I don't even remember what the changes were here. I think they just made some minor changes to the README. This would have been fine if you just said that up front, like, hey, here's some minor changes when I went for the README. I think this helps, and that's it. But this, you can go read this if you want. The link's up here. But this is kind of disrespectful to maintainers, and this is why some maintainers will choose to just stop accepting contributions altogether. Because when you do things like this, you're disrespecting their time, and you're showing the community that you don't care about them, right? You're just trying to get your green check mark on GitHub. Don't do this. Okay. And outside of that, that's really all I wanted to cover in this video. I really want to show those different things. Let me go back to this. I really want to show those different things where you have these two contribution methods. You have reporting the issues and you have actually fixing the issues. And there's these different things that you can keep in mind to make those contributions high quality, right? So if you're reporting issues, I talked about having your context there, providing that solution, understanding a solution if you can in a minimal reproduction environment. And then I talked about adhering to their code of conduct and their contribution guidelines, right? So if you keep in mind those three things, context, minimal reproduction and solution, and contribution guidelines, when you report issues, they'll come across clean and you can get people to actually look at them and triage them. Similarly, when you're proposing changes in your pull requests or whatever you're doing, if you type out a nice title and description, and in that title and description, you keep in mind, you define the problem, you detail your solution and how you thought about it, and then you keep in mind the scope of your changes. Is this too big? Should this be split out? Is my diff clean? And if you keep in mind the contribution guidelines, those three things, you'll be able to have a clean change that can get reviewed quickly by maintainers, and you can have those engineering discussions and get it merged, right? So if as long as you're adhering to those things, you'll be good. And again, you'll probably become a respected contributor. There's one of the maintainers I was talking with that prompted this whole video. They were like, hey, I remember your contribution from 2-3 years ago. I remember how you wrote it. I remember how you cared about it. I remember that you did good work. I remembered that. And since I remember that and you did good work there, I want to work with you again. So these high quality contributions are not just the benefits aren't just for the maintainers. The benefits for you too, right? Like your name goes out there. You know, people see that, and then they see if you submit one high quality contribution and then you do it again and then again, you become a respected member of the community, especially in that project. And then now you're trusted and you can do more things. But if you submit low quality contributions, you're ruining it for your name and you're ruining it for everybody else too. So don't do that. Okay. I really hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.